Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm your host, your returning host, Tim Niederreiter. And with me today is a new guest to the show, a nice guy that I've talked to for a couple minutes just before we got on the mic, JD Barker. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey man, how you doing?
I'm okay. You know, it's been a tough year so far. Tough end of last year, tough beginning to this year. But the show is still going. I'm still writing, so I'm happy enough about that. I mean, I've really gotten back on the horse as far as writing, but we can get into that more later. So for those who don't know the name, tell us a little bit about yourself, JD.
Well, in today's world, I'm a New York Times bestseller. I'm in about 150 different countries, I think 24, 25 different languages or so. Didn't start off that way, though. I indie published the first book. I just had my 10-year anniversary on that back in November, so it's been a wild ride.
Well, that's cool. So you went indie to start out with. That's interesting. So did I, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I didn't know any better. I had been working behind the scenes in the industry for a really long time. Writing is one of those things I've always done, but I had been told at an early age it's a great hobby, but you can't make a living at it. So I did what I was basically told I was supposed to do. I went off to college, I got a degree, ended up working a corporate job. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm. Did that for 23 years, and I would come home at night and I would work on books to stay sane. And over those 20 some years, I had like basically a side hustle. I was working as a ghostwriter and a book doctor. So people would bring their books to me. I would help tweak them, help them get their thoughts organized, basically turn it from an idea into a publishable novel. And I was pretty good at it. I got hired by agents. I got hired by publishers, individual authors. Over those 20 some years, I had 23 different, or I had 6 books that hit the New York Times bestseller list that I had written that all came out with other people's names on the cover.
Nice. Wow.
Which gets old after a while. So that's when my wife and I made the decision.
Go on. Sorry.
That's when my wife and I made the decision to try and figure out a way to become a full-time author. And that was a little over 10 years ago.
That's incredible. I'm sorry I interrupted you there. I just couldn't resist because that's incredible for a ghostwriter to score up that many bestsellers, I'd say. I mean, maybe not, because a lot of ghostwriters are very good at what they do, obviously. I've been a ghostwriter, not saying I was one of the ones who was really good at it. But
yeah, I did a lot of memoirs for my very first one was a football player. I was living in South Florida. I was on the sidelines at a Miami Dolphin game, and I was talking to one of the players, and a very big name player. There's an NDA, so I can't say who it was. But I asked him if he ever considered writing a book, and he said, "Yeah, he gets approached about that sort of thing all the time, but he's not a writer. He doesn't know how to do it." So I said, "Well, I am a writer, and I could do it." And that's basically how that first one came about. He went back to his agent. His agent went to the big publishers. He scored a very large advance before writing a word of that book. We ended up splitting the advance 50-50, and then I sat down with him, interviewed him, and wrote up a story in basically his voice. And I did so many memoirs. I honestly think that's what taught me how to write characters, because I had to be other people. I had to write in first person from the point of view of a female politician. So once you do that enough times, it just becomes second nature.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, I only wrote fiction when I was ghostwriting, pretty much. I mean, because that's been my skill from the beginning. Like, that's what I always wanted to do. I was foolish enough to think I could do it as a job right from the bat. So that's why I published a bunch, but I've not gotten terribly successful yet with anything. And it's all independent. Yeah.
It's a tricky thing, because I had, those 20 some years. To me, that was my education. Like, I learned how to write, in that time frame. I mean, I used to get hired by editors in New York, and they would buy a book. They would love the story. They try to get the author to tweak it. There's something wrong, like it's too long, the dialogue's bad, or they too much exposition, whatever it might be. But they would go to the author, and the author just couldn't get it done. Being a first time novelist, they were just too close to the work. So they would bring me in as a hired gun. And it's funny because in today's world, if I've got an editor and they've got a problem with one of my books, they tend to sugarcoat stuff. So they'll call you and they'll give you 2 or 3 things they love about the book. Then they'll tell you that one thing they really need you to fix. Then they end the phone call with another 2 or 3 things that they like. They kind of sandwich the bad stuff in the middle of all this good stuff. When you're a hired gun, they didn't sugarcoat anything. They would tell me this guy can't write dialogue to save his life. The ending is terrible. This is going on, that's going on. But I credit that with teaching me, what they really wanted to see. You hear that enough, and I learned what the folks in New York really wanted in a best-selling novel.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, and it mirrors some of my experience with another under an NDA. with an author that I was an indie author who I was writing for, basically a small press in his own right at this point. But I was ghostwriting, and even though the book never came out because I was going through some stuff, I've been going through some stuff for a long time. I was too slow, etc., and the pandemic had just started. I learned so much from the feedback that it was really, really helpful at that point. I mean, yeah.
The feedback is huge, and authors tend to tune it out. You know, like a lot of authors don't read the reviews. I read all of them, even the negative ones. I like to, you know, because there might be something worthwhile there. Like if somebody gives you a 1-star review and they actually give you a reason for it, and it's a legit reason, you know, I can incorporate that into the next book. You know, the 1-star reviews that say something like this isn't the genre I normally read, but you know, like those usually you can toss off to the side. They're meaningless. But even when querying agents, I know so many authors, you know, they query agents, they get rejection after rejection after rejection, and then they just decide, well, I'm just going to go ahead and indie publish it. But what they really need to do is go back to those agents, find out why everybody rejected it, see if there's a legitimate reason there, and see if it's something they can tweak and fix in the book before taking it back out. Because honestly, if you're going to indie publish a novel, if you want it to succeed, it has to be, you know, in my opinion, it needs to be a 5-star read. You really can't have anything wrong with it. As difficult as it is to do that, you know, because having a good book is only, you know, one piece of the puzzle. You know, after that, you've got marketing, you've got all this other stuff that has to happen. But if you don't have a good product, you know, something that people are going to talk about, you're dead in the water.
That's fascinating. I really like that, though, and it makes sense with my experience, because at least with because I published about 20 indie books or whatever, and most of them I think are pretty good. Keyword most, at this point, because the first one had such a tough time doing anything because I was so clamped down and tight when I was writing it. Right, I was just trying to write a book really fast because it wasn't my first novel. It was my 15th novel or something like that I'd written, and actually probably a lot more than that. Anyway, so it was like, but I was writing this book, and this was about 10 years ago. So about the same time you first published indie. Yeah. But obviously you have a few years on me. So I was just kind of like, yeah, I didn't have as much experience as you did for sure. And I published this book because I was just like, I got to do it. I got to get something out there. Right. And I was feeling the clock ticking, which is weird to say because I was only 25. And then this book comes, and this book was mostly pretty decent, but the beginning was so difficult to read because there was all this exposition stuff that I just kind of like, well, you're not supposed to put in a ton of exposition, but the story doesn't make sense if you don't. So I kind of ran up into a catch-22 there.
Yeah, I think I learned my lesson doing the book doctor stuff because every time I would pick up a book, almost every first-time novelist, they start off with that. They feel like they have to explain, create this huge setup before they actually go into the story. And when I was a book doctor, I used to cut every bit of that. Like I would figure out where the actual story started, and I'd cut off those first, 1, 2, 3 chapters, whatever it is, and start it where the story does. And then I would take a highlighter, go through all that exposition, figure out what's really important, and find some other way to seed it into the novel in a way that's keeps it interesting. So it's just it was one of those tweaks. But like you learn that over time. With pretty much anything. I mean, you've probably heard this before, but if you want to be a bricklayer, you've got to spend about 10,000 hours learning how to be a bricklayer. You're not going to throw a brain surgeon in front of an operating table on day one. There's some school involved in that, and writing is no different. You have to write in my opinion 500,000 words to 1,000,000 words before you really figure out what you're doing. And it's a lot like going to the gym. I honestly think there's a writer muscle. Like the more you do it, the stronger it gets, the easier it gets, to put those words on paper. And you have to keep exercising it. Like you have to go at it. Like I try to write every day, no matter what, because I find even if I skip, a weekend, I come back on Monday and I have to play catch up. I have to try and figure out where I was, get my mind back in the game. But if I do it every single day, I don't have any of those problems. So just all of it to me seems easier just to work hard at it.
Yeah, it's funny because, I mean, I couldn't agree more, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But because I've gone through the same thing. Sometimes when I've been working as a writer full-time, when I've been writing full-time, on occasion I would, or rather when I was unemployed and just writing, because, what else was I going to do kind of thing. I wasn't making enough money. I didn't really say it was full-time, but that's the only job I had at the time. And I noticed very heavily very bad feelings when I missed like Sunday or whatever. Like I didn't write on Sunday, so Monday I was completely out of it, kind of thing. And it is that. And again, another good example is like I worked at UPS for about 2 years. I was a package handler, a preloader, and during that time, I got into the best shape I'd ever been in, right? Because I was walking 40,000 steps every morning and loading cardboard boxes full of stuff into cars that whole time. But it didn't take long. That wasn't that long ago, and already my arms are completely flab again. Like there's like I haven't been lifting, so now I'm totally back to normal. And it only took about as long as I had at the job to completely revert. But
it's hard. It's hard to build it, and it goes away fast.
Exactly, and it happens just as quickly with writing, in my opinion. I mean, it's the people because and I was an English major in college, so I remember talking to people who were like, "I'm waiting for the good idea to start my book, to start writing my first book." Of course, I had at the time because I started writing books when I was in high school, right? So that's why I was like, so at the time I was kind of arrogant about it, but I still try to tell people like, you just need to start somewhere, right? Because that's what and that's what the encouragement side of it is to me. Like when people are like a new writer who's not ready to be published, right? Who doesn't have a book deal, or even or even the ambition to seriously publish something. I always take take this as I'm no book doctor, but I always take this because I've talked to a lot of people about writing and try to help them with their books and stuff. It's always about encouraging them first. Hence why I think publishers treat authors with such kid gloves these days, because you don't want to discourage them completely. You don't want to crash them. Like you said earlier, they'd sandwich the two good, one bad, two good. I think that's maybe a little excessive, but and it is if you're talking to somebody who needs to publish a book, whose book you already accepted, that's crazy to me.
You know what the real difference is, though, and you kind of touched on it. I talk to a lot of people that tell me, I want to write a book. I want to write a book. When you talk to somebody who I consider to be a writer, they have to write.
Yeah.
If you walk away from it, like it's this itchy thing, like you got to scratch. Like it just gets louder and louder. This voice telling you need to do it. Like like for me, like I it was a hobby long before I started getting paid for it. And every writer I've ever talked to, it's always been the same thing. Like they are driven to write. But I have talked to other people who say they want to write a book, but they can't bring themselves to put the butt in the chair and actually do it. Like to them, that it's work. Like they dread that particular process. And those people may get a book done, they may not, but chances are they're not going to be able to do this as a career. Like you really need to have that drive, and it needs to be something that's just calling you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've heard that from many guests on the show as well. But you put it quite eloquently, and I like the way you combine the muscle with the fact that you kind of have to keep doing it. It's the habit. It's almost like it becomes a habit eventually, but at first it's just this urge, this inclination to go do the thing.
Well, and it gets easier. Like back when I was working the corporate job, I was doing 60 to 80 hours a week at the corporate job, but I would still find time to write. And, that might be in line at the grocery store. It might be over my lunch hour. I'll break my phone out and just type something on my phone, whatever. But like I would find some way to force out at least 200 to 300 words a day, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that's a novel within a year if you can at least keep that pace going. And, you find that if you hit 200 words on a regular basis, it's not that hard to hit 300. It's not that hard to hit 500. When I went full time, like today, I did a little over 2,300 words. Like I do 2,000 to 3,000 words a day as a full time author. But like I build up to that, and just like you said, like if I go away somewhere, if I go off to a conference or just go on a vacation, I'm gone for a couple of days or a week, and I come back, that word count, it's not 2,300 words anymore. Like I'm struggling to get 800, 900. I got to build back up to it again, unless I consistently do it that entire time.
Yeah. How long do you devote to writing every day when you're like not on vacation, basically?
It's different now. I mean, being full time. So when I left the corporate world, I told myself I'm never going to set an alarm before 7 a.m. So I get up at 7 o'clock, go downstairs, I grab a cup of coffee, go right to my desk. I turn the internet off the night before. So when I sit down at my desk, there's no internet. And I hit the ground running. I just start writing. I read what I wrote the previous day. I edit it, clean it up. And usually by the time I get to the end of that, those couple of pages, my mind is back in the story, and I just keep going. And I pound out another another 2 to 3 thousand words. I'm usually done with that by about 10:30.
Okay.
Then I turn the internet on, and then the business side of this kind of floods my inbox. So all the emails from agents, from for shows like
Yeah.
this, interview requests, marketing, all those other the business side of this kind of floods the rest of my life. And I do that for the remainder of my business day, which ends at 3 o'clock. That's when my quitting bell rings. Then I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth in New England. I go for a run around the island. It's 4.2 miles. I
Nice.
use that time to kind of get my head on straight, figure out what I'm going to do for, with the next day. If I'm stuck in the story, I figure out what I need to do to get past that. And then the rest of the night is just I spend it with my wife and daughter and just enjoy family time and repeat every day.
Fantastic. It sounds like a good routine, to be in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it is, and I think having the routine, like for me, having that structure is really important. If it, I need that in order to keep it going.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's refreshing to hear from an author who's obviously quite successful, and well, I would say very successful by my standards anyway, as far as being a full-time career author, right? That's kind of what I would always dream about, right? Being that the guy who just all I do is write and manage the writing side of things, right? Basically manage the business, right? That's what you do, right? As far as work. And that's great. But my point, I guess, this is a long way of saying, I think it's cool that you're not putting a ton of weight on the productivity side. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I learned a long time ago. I can sit down and I can have like a marathon writing session. I can do like 6 to 10,000 words or so. But by the time I get done, you're 10 hours into it or whatever. It's like squeezing water out of a rock.
Yeah.
There's nothing left, and it's exhausting. And then you sit down the next day and you try to pick up where you left off, and that's where I would spend time staring at a blank screen. That's where writer's block would kind of kick in. And for me, I can't sustain this long term with that. I know, just from doing this for so long, like 2 to 3,000 words, like that's my sweet spot. If I write more than that, chances are I'm going to end up cutting it the next day. It just becomes filler. It becomes garbage. So like you can only get so much creativity out of your brain, I think, on a daily basis. And I think everybody's got their limits. And, for me, I had to figure out what those were.
Yeah, and I've stored up a lot over time sometimes, but yeah, it's hard for me to say how fast I actually would write if I was doing it regularly, because it's been so hard to ever do it regularly between my ADHD and all these other issues that I've been dealing with in my mental health issues over the years. But when I dictated, that was the real test of how much creativity my brain had, because that was so much faster.
I wish I could dictate. I've tried it so many times. We've interviewed, I don't know if you know Kevin J. Anderson.
Yes, I was in a book bundle with him a while ago.
Okay, he's very prolific, and he dictates everything. He goes on a walk in the woods behind his house, and he dictates every story, and he gets like 8,000 words or so in a day sometimes.
Yeah,
because dictating can be so much faster. I just can't bring myself to do it. Like I feel weird, if I'm doing it in front of other people. So I can't do it when I'm on my run. I feel weird doing it alone in my office because I feel like my wife and daughter are going to hear me talking to myself. And I honestly, I need to see the words on paper. Like I need to see them like physically in front of me. Paragraph break here, white space here, because to me the white space, like I write a lot of thrillers, and white space I use that for pacing. If I want a story to move faster, my sentences get shorter, the paragraphs are shorter, there's a lot more white space. If I want to slow things down, I might have a larger block of text, and I need to physically see that in order to get it done. But if you can figure out how to dictate and write a book that way, that is by far the most efficient way to do it.
Maybe. I mean, that's the thing. I've struggled with this because I dictated between 2019 and 2022, I dictated like 5 novels, 5 or 6, because one of those novels, I say 5 or 6 because I think one of them was the same novel again, because I went so fast at it. Because I would dictate 6,000 or 7,000 words an hour, and so then I'd do that twice a day usually. So that was not that bad for time, but my brain is mush after that, and it was so fast that I didn't dictate in front of a computer. Much like Kevin J. Anderson, I would dictate out walking around. I wouldn't be walking around town. I'd be pacing around a room in my house. But the result was this really, really messy draft that took two or three times longer to edit, more like 5 times longer to edit than just stuff I would type. And so that's where the efficiency kind of starts falling away, right? It's efficient to get the rough draft down, but how long do you have to edit it? It's that kind of thing.
That's the thing. Yeah, you got to figure out if it's
There's
it's your sweet spot or not. For Kevin, like I know that he used to send those tapes, physical cassettes, off to a transcription company. They would type it up and they would clean it up, and then he would still have to go back through and edit. But he's able to dictate it fairly clean. Like I wouldn't, like I would have to start and stop and start and stop and go back. And, like I sometimes spend, time just on one sentence of dialogue is going over and over it, which you can't really do when you're dictating. So, I think every writer should try all these different things. Like you can kind of see it in the corner of my screen, but I've got a typewriter back there. So I've got a novel that I'm writing on the typewriter. Every day I just write a couple sentences on it. I've got another one that I'm writing longhand on notepads. I find that my voice is different when I change the medium up. And I've never shied away from trying new methods because like I feel like I'm always changing, I'm always evolving. When I get bored with trying new stuff, that might be the day I actually retire. But you never know where you might learn something. Like I considered myself a pantser for years, which I'm guessing you've probably talked about on your show before.
Definitely.
Basically I would come up with my plot, my characters, I'd mix it all together and just kind of let the story tell itself. I thought that was the best way to do it, and then I got a phone call one day from James Patterson, and we ended up writing a book together. And the first book we wrote together, I actually got him to pants a novel for the very first time, which was interesting because he had never done it before. And we had a ball, going back and forth on it. But when we finished that up, he said, I want you to try it my way. Here's an outline. So he gave me an outline for a book that he had been working on called The Noise. And I got to see how much more efficient that process was. Like we had the entire framework for the story in front of us. We wrote that first draft in no time, and there was very little editing involved because we knew where it was going to go. And what I quickly realized is like I go up for those runs every day. I think about what I'm going to do next in the story. When I was pantsing a novel, I was basically using that brain power to figure out what comes next. But when I have an outline in front of me, that same brain power is going towards how do I make what comes next better, because I already know what comes next. So the story was way tighter. So he convinced me, after years and years of working as a pantser, he convinced me to outline, and I've been doing that ever since.
That's fascinating. I've been discovery writing or pantsing for a long time, actually. I mean, most of my books have been discovery writing, more or less, because I found that the outline never... I mean, I was frustrated in my 20s, basically, because I was like, this outline never stays the same. And now I think I should just roll with that and still outline. You know what I mean? Go back to trying to outline again and roll with the fact that there may be changes because I think it's partially because I'm not that thorough of a thinker in the first time through anything. So if I see a chance to punch it up, I can do that. But also I'm curious about I know it's not your outline strictly, but James Patterson's outline, you said, how detailed did he outline? I mean, based on what you saw.
Usually, I mean, we've written 5 books together at this point, and his outlines are pretty strong, like 30 to 40,000 words in some cases. 30, 40, 50 pages.
Okay.
It's fairly detailed, but one of the things because he taught me how to outline, and one of the keys to it, in my opinion, is creating basically a skeleton for the story. You don't want to get too detailed in your outline because then it feels very rigid. You almost feel like you're painting by numbers. But so we just come up with basic bullet points, and we'll expand something a little bit if we have ideas to go in there. But we just want to know what those signposts are, to get us from our starting point to our destination and the things in between. And you can't be afraid to shy away from that because some of the best stuff comes from you're writing something. You stumble into a part of the outline, story goes off in a different direction. You need to follow those threads and see them through. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But a lot of times that's where the gold is. So over time you learn to what to trust and what not to. Yeah,
I mean, and that makes some sense. Basically, like what I told you before, when I was dictating novels, I dictated the sequel to my first Demon Hunter book, which is epic fantasy, and the sequel called Shadow Prince. The first time I dictated it, it was a completely different book than the one that I have released now. I actually had to go back and do the whole rough draft again because I'm like, there's just no way I can fix this. I need to add a new character. I need to change the entire story, what it's about. Actually, basically, had to change, and that was kind of demoralizing at the time because the fact was that I did that first draft in 2 weeks basically because I was dictating so fast, right? It was like, okay, it's done now. And then as I read it, I said, this isn't what I want. So it wasn't that big of a waste of time, but it was a little bit of a body blow to know that, I could still go completely off track there.
Yeah, I think you can't be afraid to do that. I mean, on that same book, The Noise, it got picked up by a studio called E1 very early on. So probably from like chapter 4, chapter 5, they were reading every chapter as we wrote.
Wow.
And giving us feedback, so it's tricky enough to write a book on your own. When you're working with a co-author, now you've got two voices in the room. When you've got a studio involved, all of a sudden you've got writers, producers, directors, and the guy who actually has the checkbook, like all weighing in on everything that you're writing. So for that particular book, I think we wrote 6 different endings. So like you think you've got the story down on paper, like this ending makes sense. This is the ending that I envisioned for this. You write it, you turn it in, and they say, well, we can't film that. It's too expensive. Let's try something else. So you give them a totally different ending. And like, to me, like the story is the story. Like it doesn't necessarily have a different ending. The first ending I used is the ending. So you have to kind of train yourself to be open-minded to that sort of thing, to those kind of changes. Ultimately, 6 different endings. The sixth one, in my opinion, is the best one. And I wouldn't have gotten there, and Jim and we wouldn't have gotten there together without that studio pushing us. So you never know how these things are going to evolve.
Yeah. That reminds me of this exercise. It's actually very similar to this exercise that I've used for a while myself. It's that when you have a place where it's like, okay, I'm not sure what goes here kind of thing, but that the obvious answer, there's an obvious answer, right? There's like this, the car blows up or whatever is the most obvious thing to happen with the car bomb, for example, in the plot. Right. But then what if something else happens is kind of the rest of the list. It's just a list of bullet points of what other things that could happen there until you get to the point where something that's unexpected but still makes sense. Basically, and frequently I'll make this list 5 to 10 things long, and then I'll combine a couple of the later ones to kind of get the real answer, what really happens in the story when I'm stuck.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I write those out. So if I've got 5 different options, I'll write all 5 of those scenes, and then go with the one that feels right and moves the story forward in the best possible way. I write thrillers, so a lot of times if it makes sense for the character to go through door A, then you have to send them through door B. If the car is supposed to start here, then you got to make sure the car doesn't start. Like when you're writing a thriller, like 1 + 1 can't equal 2; it needs to equal 3. You have to. You have to do something unique. Yeah,
and you can't be too convenient for your characters, especially if you're going for the right. Because it's all about boring, putting them into more pressure, right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like everything needs to create new questions. Like anytime you answer something, it should generate 2 new questions to keep the story moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really do, I mean, I write primarily fantasy, but I have been dabbling with the idea of trying to write some horror. Or maybe more thriller. I don't know which one. I honestly cannot tell the difference between some of these books. Like what is it? Relic? Forget. It was a co-authored book. I forget who wrote Relic.
Douglas and Preston.
Yeah, exactly. That book was really good, and to me, it felt like this is like a classic horror movie kind of setup. But people call it a thriller. I'm like, okay, so what's the difference?
Well, with
it's a little less visceral than some, but yeah.
Yeah, so that's a writing partner, Doug Preston and
Lincoln Child.
I forget their Lincoln Child, yeah, and they've been writing thrillers together forever. So that this might have been the first one where they actually included elements of horror in it.
Oh, okay.
So from a marketing standpoint, they had to go with it. This is still a thriller, but. I think if that would have been their first novel, they might have been called horror authors straight off the bat, and it might have changed a lot of things. But they had a number of novels before them already as thrillers.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. So at that point, it's more of the brand than the actual content.
Yeah. I mean, from my standpoint, like I love writing thrillers. I love writing horror. And the minute you get an agent, they try to pigeonhole you. An agent says you are a horror author, you're a thriller author, you're a fantasy author. They want to put you in that box because they need that in order to sell you to an editor. The editor needs to be able to turn around and tell the marketing people you're a fantasy author. So the marketing people can tell the bookstore authors where to put you on the shelf. Like there's this whole line of people that need to define who you are. I'm scared to death of writing that same book over and over again. Like for me, like my second book was called The Fourth Monkey. It's about a serial killer in Chicago, and that one sold really, really well. And all the publishers wanted was that same book again, but different. Give me that same story, but different. And there was no way I was going to do that, so I wrote a horror novel. And I bounced back and forth between the 2 different genres, which my agent hated, my publishers hated. but we still sold the film options for everything. And what we've learned over time is it's almost like being a literary Pied Piper. You have your core audience, which is thriller fans, and if you write something that's got horror in it, all of a sudden your thriller fans read it, but you grab this new group of horror readers that wouldn't have found you before, and you bring them into the fold. So I've learned to capitalize on that. At one point, I was told that my audience is women 45 and over. So I went out and I wrote a young adult book. Now all of a sudden, my audience is now 20 something and over. So I look at the places where I'm selling, and I also look at the places where I'm not, and try to figure out how to use all these different things, as tools in the toolbox to try and expand that audience.
Nice. So when you say you went and wrote a young adult novel, I guess no, maybe that's not the right question. What I was thinking is, you have this audience, right? That you're talking about your audience, and you said it was predominantly women over 45, right? That's what you were told.
Correct.
How do you? Is there any difference? Does the women part make any difference to you as an author? Does it make any difference to write for different demographics? Do you try to? Because obviously you went and wrote one in a young adult book that's for younger readers, but I've heard in various places, right, that people say readers are predominantly female. Like what? How does that work? Do you think?
Yeah, that just happens to be the case. What I find is most of my male readers come to me because the woman in their life read one of my books and said, "Hey, you need to check this out." It usually doesn't go in the other direction, and that's just from what I can tell, that's the way that it is. I know a lot of big name authors, and they all have basically that same story. The women tend to be their predominant readers. For the books to really do well, you need word of mouth. So you need to write that 5-star book that somebody's going to close the cover on and go tell 3 of their friends. And in the most cases, it tends to be women that do that.
Ah, okay. That's an interesting way to put it too, and it makes me think. Even if you start out with a book that attracts predominantly, or I'd say attracted 50-50 people by the cover and the blurb and whatever, you're saying it spreads more to among women is kind of what you're saying. It's what it sounded like.
They tend to talk like most guys don't necessarily talk about what they're reading.
That's true.
Tell their buddies, hey, you should check out this book. Women do. It's just one of those fundamental differences between us. If you go to a book club, it's most likely predominantly women.
That's also true that I've seen. Yes. So good point, and that's pretty illuminating because it's not like I write books that I've not got so far into it thinking like I need to write this book. This book is for X demographic, except I write toward genre, but not toward a demographic, right? Yeah.
It depends, I think, a lot on the genre. So if you take something like a Jack Reacher book, that's geared initially towards military. It was geared towards men, but it fit a very specific group. It's expanded since then. Lee Child still has a ton of women readers. But if I had to guess, he's probably very close to 50-50 between the two because of the actual subject matter. But just straight up mass market fiction, which is what I write, like what Stephen King writes, what Dean Kuhn writes, James Patterson, tends to be women, predominantly are the reader base.
Yeah, and there's a reason that, say in my subgenre, or genre rather, romantasy is such a huge deal right now because it's basically fantasy that's directly targeted toward women in maybe the most stereotypical way possible, or most obvious way, right? And I'm not saying not all women, that it always has to be a romance, right? Obviously, everyone you named is, as commercial fiction, it writes pretty much dark fiction, right? Horror fiction, like Stephen King and stuff, stuff like that. The darker, more thrillery side of things. And obviously, so it goes, they're all over the place, right? People are.
Yeah, I think the point is, what I'm trying to get at is, ultimately, I try to take a step back, and I don't look at myself as an author, and I don't look at my books necessarily as books. I look at them as widgets. They're a product that needs to be bought and sold. So I just try to uncover the actual demographic that's buying it, and figure out who isn't, and build on those different things. And I think any author needs to do that. The audience is always going to be different. The readership is always going to be different. It's really important who your audience is, in order to give them the book that they're looking for. And once you define your audience, you understand who they are. You're able to expand on it.
That makes sense. Yeah, and maybe that's one of the reasons I haven't had that much success yet. I don't target the audience that much. I don't think about who would read this other than me, right? Because but that's because that's what they, that's the common advice is always like, why would you write something is the first question. And then who is your book for is kind of a second question. But then usually the answer for a beginning writer is you should write for yourself first. At least that's the one I like. But on the other hand, what you're saying is, as a professional writer, as a, writer that is doing this for your living, you need to know who's going to buy this book. You need more than an ideal reader, and it can't just be a demographic of one,
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix of all of that. I think in order, especially for a first-time author, to get that first book done, writing for yourself is probably key because you're telling yourself a story that you want to hear, which means you're going to be excited about telling it. You're going to be excited about reading it. I think that's a great way to learn the skill set that you need in order to take it to that next level. But yeah, at some point you need to be able to, take a step back and say, hey, listen, I would like to capture this particular demographic. How can I do it? And I do a lot of different things. Like if you go to my Wikipedia page, it defines me as a suspense author who may include elements of horror, may include elements of sci-fi, may include this, may include that. But suspense has always been my common thread. And I know that as long as I have that common thread and it's consistent through every book, my core audience will always follow me and I can reach out and grab from these other places when I decide to dabble in them.
Yeah, and that's a great, so you've like a core kind of content premise almost.
Yeah,
it's going to be tense. There's going to be there's going to be suspense, and people will be on the edge of their seat, kind of thing. Yeah,
and I think it's important that you have to define that not only for yourself, so you know what you're writing, but for other people. Somebody like you. I'm guessing before we sat down, you probably went on Google and you researched me. Like my Wikipedia page is the first thing that comes up, which means that is basically how I'm defined to you, which kind of influences the questions and the things we're going to talk about. It's called creating an information loop. If you take marketing classes, so you're basically defining the talk about you, what is being generated. You can control all that if just like any company does. If you take a step back and look at Kraft, look at Nabisco, look at Nike, they define that story that people tell about them, and you can do it too as an author.
Yeah. And I try, I think I've got to try to do more of that self-definition then. That's definitely interesting to me. So,
well, it sounds like you need to find your sweet spot. I know a lot of people that they write that first book and they get it out of their system, then they write a different another book and it's totally different from the first one. You need to figure out what you want to be as an author. What story you want to tell. And I think once you land on that, it gives you a jumping off point to kind of expand on the rest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So so JD. We are running a little short on time, so let's. Where can people find you around the internet and other places? I guess.
Easiest place to find me is at jdbarker.com. The books are in pretty much every bookstore. Depending on when this airs, I've got a couple books coming out. I've got one called The Writer with James Patterson coming out on March 17th, and then my next solo title is called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's about a haunted house. The tagline is, "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die," and that one comes out on May 13th. 2025.
Nice. Thanks so much for being on the show, JD. That was great. And as for this podcast, you can find more about me, Tim Need a Writer, at my website, timneedawriter.com, which is spelled like the words that my name sounds like, not like my actual name, because the name spelling is confusing. So thanks for listening, everybody. I will talk to you again soon. Stay safe out there. And keep reading and keep writing. Bye-bye.